Client build 16 typewriter has returned to us for a rebuild and upgrades after 6 years. People often ask me, how long does a liquid cooled build last? You know, when do you need to start doing major maintenance? Not just coolant change, but properly flushing things out, you know, replacing corroded components. And it varies a lot. You know, this build, we're going to find out though how it is after 6 years. I have builds out there that have been running up to 8 years and they're still okay. Generally, particle coolants definitely don't last anywhere near as long because, you know, I have other builds with particle coolants that have only lasted a couple of years before the coolant starts to separate. I actually probably won't use particle coolants again unless customers really, you know, strongly request it, but then I'll be warning them about it, that you're probably going to need to change it every couple of years. A lot of people are rebuilding their liquid cooled systems every couple of years anyway, replacing CPUs, motherboards, and GPUs. Whenever you do an upgrade, you know, even if it's just the GPU, I would just completely rebuild your entire loop. So replace all of the tube because it's probably a bit faded and stained. Check out everything for corrosion. You know, the radiators you're not going to be able to ever see the inside of, but if there's no debris in the loop and if everything else looks okay, like the fittings and the water blocks, then the radiators should be okay. And, you know, if you really spend a lot of time flushing and cleaning everything, then it should be okay. But the radiators are one of those things that, you know, can be a little bit doubtful, and you may just want to replace them if it's been, you know, a few years and you're not fully confident. It is one of those things that, yeah, you might just want to replace. But yeah, generally if the rest of the loop is looking clean and you can't see corrosion anywhere else, then you should be fine. The place that you really notice it is in the water blocks, the jet plates. If you start to see build up there, then you probably, you know, you have a look at what that is in the jet plates. Is it little bits of metal? You know, is it blue, green from the copper? Or is it just kind of little bits of soft algae or coagulated coolant? But yeah, there's so many variables involved and every build is different. Now, I think this build has actually not been up and running for a couple of years. I think something went wrong. The customer mentioned at some point something failed. The motherboard possibly, we're going to find out what it is. These motherboards ran very hot. I actually have one of these still in an old build from, you know, around the same time that I built this system. It was a personal build and that motherboard recently failed, but even with a mono block on it, the CPU and the board just used to run super hot. So I'm kind of expecting it to be the board in this, but it could also just be the power supply. We really don't know yet, but I think, yeah, it's been sitting for a while. So even though the coolant looks okay here, where it's sitting in, you know, the radiators and the other components, it might be like really bad. But we'll get to stripping this thing down. It is going to be completely stripped because most of the components are being replaced. Motherboard, CPU, memory, GPU, some of the liquid cooling components. But yeah, it's definitely nice to have it back in the workshop, and it's in great condition. Like, there's hardly any scratches or marks on any of the panels. I did notice a couple of marks over here, but I can just buff those out. It's probably just actually in the wax on the surface because we put a nice thick coat of wax to help to protect the surface. So really there's no visible wear and tear, no damage from shipping, and this has been shipped long distances, just like all of our builds. But it's generally these smaller builds that survive very well. You know, our Spectre builds survive very well also. It's the bigger ones that you need to be a bit more careful with, like big Case Labs THW10, just because of those very long tube lengths, things start to get a bit weak. You really need to put a lot more time into reinforcing them and a lot more care into the shipping. But, you know, this one pretty much just got put into the flight case, and there's only a couple of bits of internal reinforcing foam here that the customer has installed, and yeah, everything is fine. It arrived perfectly safely. But yeah, it's great to see the build in this condition after such a long period of time. Like there's no external corrosion on any of the fittings. Sometimes they get all these pit marks all over them if they're in like a really humid environment, or maybe exposed to the outdoors a little bit near an open window. But yeah, this just looks great. There's like not even any dust, hardly any dust, like for 6 years. If you look at this, it's just very, very little. I think the customer has done an excellent job of looking after it. We'll take a look at the fin arrays on the radiators to see if there's any dust build up there, but he's probably kept it very clean. No dust on that radiator. But these radiators also have quite a, you know, a sparse fin array, so the dust just passes right through. Anyway, let's get to stripping this thing down. So I've almost finished stripping the build down. I am going to completely strip it all away, mainly so that I can properly flush all of the liquid cooling components, but just so that I can inspect everything and clean everything up. I like to have a look at all of the fittings, the O-rings, but something I was very surprised about is that these fittings weren't difficult to undo. What normally happens with fittings is the O-rings go rock hard. You know, it could be from the heat, from the coolant over time, and then the fittings are very hard to undo and the O-rings stay compressed. So if you try to reuse the fittings, they don't seal as well. And usually the O-rings need to be replaced, and sometimes the fittings have to be replaced. But all of these O-rings are nice and soft and still like new. So that's very good to see. But best of all, take a look at this filter. So this is an extremely fine aquacomputer filter, and I don't even recommend using filters in loops because they often just end up causing a blockage which like destroys the pump and overheats the components, because most loops will build up something over time, whether it's a little bit of corrosion, you know, bits and pieces, or a bit of microbial growth, or the coolant starting to separate or coagulate or something like that, it's just better to avoid it because it's just another risk. Although when it is on full display like this, it's something you can deal with pretty quickly if you keep an eye on it, but just take a look at that. There's not a single speck of anything in there. So there is absolutely no microbial growth or corrosion or anything going wrong with this loop, even after 6 years. And I drained the coolant out of the components as well, like tipped it, the radiators upside down and the GPU water block here, and I just couldn't get anything out. This coolant is like brand new, and it still smells all right too, because that's another thing that happens as the coolant starts to get old. It, you know, starts to smell a bit off, a bit wrong. So the other thing that I wanted to look at was dust. This build doesn't have any dust filters, and that's something that people have often questioned over the years. Why aren't you using dust filters? I started out using them in the old days, but I find that they just filter all of the dust out of the air, out of the room, and it just becomes something that you need to maintain all of the time. It blocks up very quickly. It restricts a lot of airflow as it is. If you build a system right, you don't really need them. And what I really want to see though is this intake, you know, between the fans and the radiator, on the radiator fins, how bad it is. But I have not been able to find any dust buildup yet. Actually, the other radiator is already out of here, but I'll bring that in so that I can give you a look. There's not even a speck of dust on it. So no dust filters, and we do have positive pressure in this case, but I think with the density of the radiator fins, the majority of the dust is just passing straight through, and a little bit of it is settling on the surface, which you can see, you know, just that little film of dust. But with filters, the majority of the dust is just going to build up and settle on the filters. So you're going to be working on it a lot more often. And you can see the components are just all spotless. I mean, there's a little bit of something on here. This makes me think it was some polish or something that was sprayed at some point, and there was like a little bit of overspray and it wasn't wiped off. But that will just come straight off with any light metal polish and just a microfiber cloth. It's really not a problem at all. Take a look at the motherboard. You know, usually you get a lot of dust sitting around all of the components on the board, which is very hard to clean off, but just there's nothing there. It looks like new. So I have the top radiator here, and you can see that it's spotless. So that had a fan up there that was exhausting, pulling air from inside of the case. It's a little bit wet because I'm going to just wash the whole thing to get any dust out that might be in between the fins. But you would be able to see if dust had been sitting here, because it causes corrosion and, you know, discoloration of the metal. So it just doesn't look like any dust has been sitting there at all. A little bit of dust on the power supply, but that's face down. You know, it might have been down towards the carpet. So you can see that's been sitting there quite a while. Actually, I noticed something about the power supply. It has something loose inside of it, and it was face down, so I don't think anything has dropped in. So we'll find out what that is. Could be an insect or something like that. So we finally found some dust, and what this shows is that the customer has been maintaining it. He has been dust cleaning it. So, you know, what I was saying about the dust just passing straight through, that's not entirely it, although from experience it definitely does happen. And, you know, compared to dust filters, there's a lot less maintenance, but it does build up eventually, and it has. And this uneven dust here shows that, you know, it would have been even all the way around, but this is the part that the customer has missed when he's tried to blow out the dust. And that's just because, you know, it was very tight down in here to get something in there to blow it out or vacuum it. And you can see dust has been sitting for a while because of the discoloration, so it's discolored where the dust has been sitting. Not much on the fans though, and it would have been quite hard to blow out the insides of these fans. So yeah, definitely not bad at all, and great to see that it's been well maintained. So that's it, it's completely stripped down. Now all I'm going to do is just give the case a bit of a dust clean, blow it out, wipe it down. I'm going to leave this assembled and just hook up a loop to both sides and, you know, flush it one way and then flush it back the other way, because it was one of the few parts of this that was very hard to assemble just because of the way these water blocks are designed. You can see the bolts are captive in there once the hard drives are installed, and then I have nuts on the other side. And I don't think these are even the bolts that came with it. I had to, you know, figure out bolts. So yeah, I won't go pulling that off. It's not really necessary when we can just flush it where it is anyway. And I know that all of these O-rings are good because I've checked all of the others, and yeah, all of the fittings are good. So I am very tempted to polish up this piece of brass, but knowing the customer, he's actually going to want it to stay like this because he wanted this to be bare brass to take on the look of, you know, corroded metal. And that's what all of this is about as well. It's like, you know, burned and discolored and corroded copper, the custom paint job. So we're just testing the core components now to see what the problem was that the customer reported. I didn't even try to boot the system. We'll just get those components onto a test bed and find out what's really wrong with them, but I'm suspecting, yeah, PSU or motherboard. So that's it, everything is ready to go for the rebuild, fully stripped down, all of the components are cleaned, but I just found out that we're missing a part. The customer sent us the parts for this build, so we're just gonna have to wait on that one to arrive. I wanted to actually get into this rebuild right now, but yeah, we definitely can't go ahead without that part. We tested the components. The PSU is fine. It just had a couple of eggs inside of it. I think spider eggs are what was rattling around. The motherboard is definitely dead though. Error code 71. It's similar to what I've seen with this board before. I mentioned that I had one in a personal rig, which had lasted a bit longer than this one, quite a bit, a couple of years I think. But it did have a monoblock on it. And what I've seen with these boards is they ran hot. These early ITX boards, you know, they all kind of had this problem. It should have lasted longer than this, but I guess 6 years is not bad, and it's getting replaced anyway, so it doesn't really matter. It was just out of interest. One more thing I should mention about dust is that dust filters would be fine if they actually stopped all of the dust. So yeah, I think I forgot to mention that. They don't. Dust still gets in, you still need to dust clean. It just takes a little longer. So if I'm dust cleaning and maintaining, I'd rather just give it a full proper blowout, because you're going to really have to do that anyway. But that's it for now. The next part will be obviously the rebuild.